I'm Amelia, 38 years old, and for the most part, content with the trajectory of my life. I'm a software engineer, a career that provides both intellectual stimulation and financial stability. I don't have a partner, nor do I actively seek one. My life revolves around my work, my passion for amateur astronomy. I have a telescope that's practically a member of my family, and the occasional weekend hike in the nearby mountains. I value my independence and the quiet rhythm of my days. But if you'd witnessed the annual Henderson family barbecue last month, you'd have thought I was some sort of social pariah for not being married with 2.5 children and a white picket fence. Family gatherings are, in theory, meant to be pleasant affairs, a chance to reconnect, share some laughs, and perhaps indulge in a bit too much potato salad. Mine, however, feel more like a carefully orchestrated interrogation. The moment I stepped onto the porch of my Aunt Carol's sprawling suburban home, I could sense the familiar undercurrent of scrutiny. The subtle nods between my aunts, the overly enthusiastic greetings, the pointed questions, it was all there, a well-rehearsed performance. I'd barely managed to deposit my contribution to the potluck, a homemade key lime pie, before the first volley was fired. "Still flying solo, Amelia?" My cousin, Bethany, inquired, her voice carrying across the crowded living room. Bethany, mother of 4 and a prolific poster of family photos on every social media platform imaginable, was holding court by the fireplace, showcasing her youngest child's latest artistic endeavors, finger paintings, mostly. Must be nice to have all that me time. What do you even do with all that freedom? I offered a polite smile and a non-committal shrug. Engaging would only fuel the fire. But, of course, it didn't end there. Another cousin, Mark, chimed in, waxing lyrical about how his life had truly begun after the birth of his twins. Then, a well-meaning but utterly tone-deaf aunt asked, "Have you ever thought about, freezing your eggs? It's not too late, but, well, It was as if they'd convened a secret meeting beforehand, plotting the most effective ways to make me feel inadequate. The comments were delivered with a veneer of sugary concern, as if they were genuinely trying to help, but the judgment was as palpable as the humidity hanging heavy in the summer air. Even my own mother, bless her heart, couldn't resist joining the chorus. She casually mentioned that I was missing out on the best years and that every woman deserves to experience the unconditional love of a child. My father, ever the supportive husband, nodded along, adding a wistful comment about how much he'd love to have grandchildren to spoil. I attempted to steer the conversation towards my recent promotion at work, or my plans to visit the very large telescope in Chile next year, but it was like talking to a brick wall. My achievements, my passions, held no currency in this particular arena. The only things that seemed to matter were wedding rings, baby bumps, and perfectly coordinated family portraits. At some point, the conversation shifted, almost reluctantly, to my older brother, Daniel. Growing up, Daniel had been the charismatic one, the golden boy, the one who effortlessly charmed everyone he met. He was the athlete, the scholar, the all-around star. If there was a spotlight, Daniel was basking in it. But things had taken a dark turn for Daniel in his early 20s. He'd gotten involved with a fast crowd, experimented with drugs, and quickly spiraled into addiction. He dropped out of college, lost a series of jobs, and became estranged from the family. The last time I'd seen him was at a disastrous family intervention, years ago, that ended with him storming out, shouting accusations and obscenities. When Daniel's name was mentioned, the room fell noticeably quieter. It was as if everyone had collectively decided to avoid that particular minefield. My Aunt Susan, however, mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Daniel's daughter, Chloe, was now in the foster care system. She said it with the same detached tone she might use to comment on the rising price of gasoline. I was stunned. Chloe. I'd never met her, but I knew she was about 8 years old now. The last I'd heard, she was living with Daniel and one of his girlfriends. Apparently, that arrangement hadn't lasted. "What do you mean, she's in foster care?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Aunt Susan shrugged, a gesture that seemed to dismiss the entire situation. "Well, Daniel. His choices, they have consequences. Poor girl. But what can you do? I looked around the room, expecting anyone, to express some concern, some outrage, some emotion. But they all simply resumed their previous conversations, as if Chloe were a figment of my imagination. I pressed my parents for more information, but they brushed me off. You wouldn't understand, Amelia. My mother said, her tone dismissive. It's complicated. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. I couldn't shake the image of Chloe, an 8-year-old girl, abandoned by her father and seemingly forgotten by the very people who should have been her safety net. And here they were, lecturing me about responsibility and family values. When I got home that night, I couldn't let it go. I started researching, trying to find out anything I could about Chloe's situation. It didn't take long to uncover some basic information. She'd been in the system for a couple of years, shuffled between several different foster homes. The more I read, the more my anger grew. How could my family simply pretend she didn't exist? How could they sit there, judging my life choices, while turning a blind eye to a child in desperate need of help? The next morning, I contacted a social worker at the county's Child Protective Services. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I knew it would be messy, complicated, and potentially life-altering. But I couldn't stand the thought of Chloe being lost in the system, another statistic. If my family wouldn't step up, then maybe, just maybe, I could. This wasn't about proving a point to anyone. It wasn't about silencing their judgment or making myself feel better. It was about Chloe, a little girl who deserved far better than the hand she'd been dealt. And I wasn't going to let her slip through the cracks. The following days were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and frantic online searches. I learned the intricacies of the foster care system, the legal hurdles, the emotional challenges. The social worker I spoke with, a woman named Mrs. Ramirez, was initially cautious, understandably so. She explained that Chloe had experienced significant trauma and instability, and that building trust would take time. When I asked about Chloe's specific situation, Mrs. Ramirez mentioned attachment issues, emotional outbursts, and difficulties in school. It didn't surprise me. How could a child endure so much upheaval and not bear the scars? Mrs. Ramirez was hesitant to allow a visit, explaining that Chloe had a history of reacting poorly to new people. But after learning that I was a biological relative, albeit a distant one, she agreed to arrange a supervised meeting. She warned me, repeatedly, to manage my expectations. A week later, I found myself standing outside a nondescript building that housed the local foster care offices. My palms were sweating, my heart was racing, and I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I had no idea what to expect. Mrs. Ramirez led me down a hallway lined with brightly colored, but slightly worn, children's artwork. We stopped outside a small room furnished with mismatched chairs and a table littered with crayons and drawing paper. Chloe was sitting at the table, hunched over a piece of paper, her dark hair falling across her face. She looked much smaller than I'd imagined an 8-year-old would be. She didn't look up when I entered. I sat down across from her, feeling awkward and unsure of myself. Mrs. Ramirez introduced me as Chloe's aunt, Amelia. Chloe glanced at me briefly, her eyes dark and wary, then returned to her drawing. Her shoulders were tense, and she gripped the crayon tightly. I didn't want to overwhelm her, so I simply commented on her drawing. She was sketching a horse, a surprisingly detailed and graceful depiction of the animal. When I complimented her on it, she mumbled a quick thanks but didn't stop drawing. The first meeting was, to put it mildly, awkward. It was filled with long silences, punctuated by my attempts at small talk and Chloe's monosyllabic responses. But despite the awkwardness, I felt a pull towards her, a connection I couldn't quite explain. She didn't trust me, and why should she? But I knew, with a certainty that surprised even me, that I wanted to come back. When I told my family about the visit, their reactions were predictable. My mother rolled her eyes and accused me of being melodramatic. My father scoffed and said I was playing the martyr. My cousins, predictably, made snide remarks about how I'd bitten off more than I could chew. Their words stung, but they didn't deter me. I wasn't doing this for them. Over the next few weeks, I visited Chloe several more times. She remained cautious, guarded, but slowly, gradually, she began to open up. I brought her a set of colored pencils on one visit, and her face lit up for the first time. She loved to draw, especially animals, horses, dogs, cats, even fantastical creatures from her imagination. I asked her about her favorite books, and she rattled off a list of fantasy novels. I made a mental note to read them, so I'd have something to talk to her about. Little by little, she started sharing fragments of her life, snippets of memories of her father, before the drugs took over, stories about her foster families, some good, some not so good, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian one day. It was heartbreaking to hear, but I listened without interrupting, without judging. I let her talk, let her express the pain and confusion that had been bottled up inside her for so long. By the time I decided to formally begin the process of becoming Chloe's foster parent, I had no illusions about the challenges ahead. The paperwork alone was daunting, a mountain of forms, applications, and background checks. The system, it seemed, was designed to weed out anyone who wasn't fully committed. Some of my friends were supportive, offering words of encouragement and practical help. Others, however, raised eyebrows, questioning my sanity. They reminded me that Chloe came with baggage, that I was taking on a huge responsibility, that I was giving up my freedom. Their doubts didn't change my mind, but they did force me to confront the reality of the situation. I was, in many ways, unprepared. I'd never been responsible for another human being, let alone a child with a history of trauma. My parents were furious when they found out about my plans. They accused me of embarrassing the family and bringing further shame upon them. My mother even went so far as to say I was stealing Daniel's child, a statement that was both absurd and deeply hurtful, considering how they'd effectively abandoned Chloe. After one particularly heated argument, I stopped answering their calls. Thankfully, not everyone was against me. A couple of close friends helped me prepare a room for Chloe. We painted the walls a soft lavender, her favorite color, and assembled a small desk where she could draw. We hung shelves for her books and art supplies, and added a cozy rug to make the space feel more inviting. I wanted her to feel like she had a place that was truly hers, even if she wasn't living with me yet. During one visit, Chloe told me that she'd been bullied at school. The other kids teased her about being in foster care, about not having a real family. I could see the hurt in her eyes, even though she tried to pretend it didn't bother her. I promised myself, then and there, that I would change that. She deserved to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel like she belonged. The process hit a snag when the agency requested family references. My parents, predictably, refused to vouch for me, claiming I was unfit to raise a child. It felt like a betrayal, a punch to the gut. But I didn't let it stop me. I found colleagues, friends, even my astronomy club members, who were more than willing to speak on my behalf. Eventually, Chloe came for her first overnight visit at my apartment. She was nervous, and so was I. We attempted to make pizza for dinner, but it turned into a chaotic mess, with flour everywhere and a slightly burnt crust. But we laughed, we made memories, and that's what mattered. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she asked, hesitantly, "Can I come back again?" I told her she was always welcome. It wasn't perfect, and I knew there were many more challenges ahead. But in that moment, it felt like we were on the right path, two unlikely souls finding a connection amidst the chaos. The wheels of the foster care system, slow and creaky as they were, began to turn. The first major hurdle was the home inspection. The social worker, Mrs. Ramirez, scheduled a visit, and suddenly my tidy apartment felt woefully inadequate. I spent the week before her arrival childproofing every corner, installing outlet covers, rearranging furniture, and stocking the refrigerator with kid-friendly snacks. A friend helped me assemble a second-hand bookcase for Chloe's room, which she'd already begun decorating with her drawings. On the day of the inspection, I was a bundle of nerves. But Mrs. Ramirez, surprisingly, didn't seem overly critical. She walked through the apartment methodically, checking off items on her list. When she reached Chloe's room, she paused, looking at the drawings and the carefully arranged art supplies. "She's going to feel comfortable here," she said, a hint of a smile on her face. It was the first moment I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could actually do this. Then came the financial strain. I hadn't fully realized how expensive the process of becoming a foster parent could be. There were application fees, legal costs, and the unexpected expenses of providing for Chloe's needs. Every time I checked my bank account, I felt a wave of anxiety. But giving up wasn't an option. I cut back on non-essential expenses, foregoing things like takeout dinners and my subscription to the astronomy magazine. Every spare dollar was channeled towards getting through the next step. A few weeks later, I received a call informing me that the custody hearing was scheduled. I would need to provide evidence that I could provide a stable and nurturing environment for Chloe, long-term. That meant gathering financial statements, employment records, and personal references. Mrs. Ramirez reassured me that I was on the right track, but the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. During one of Chloe's visits, she started calling me Aunt Mimi instead of just Amelia. It caught me off guard, but I didn't correct her. She also asked if she could put up some glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling of her room. We spent the afternoon sticking them up together, and later, when we turned off the lights, her smile illuminated the room. But the next blow came from my parents. I learned, through a third party, that they'd written a letter to the court, formally objecting to my becoming Chloe's foster parent. They called me irresponsible and selfish, claiming I lacked the experience to raise a child. The letter was brutal, a calculated attempt to sabotage my efforts. I hadn't expected their support, but actively working against me, that felt like a new low. I hired a lawyer to counter their claims and began gathering testimonials from friends, colleagues, and neighbors who could vouch for my character. One of my coworkers wrote about how I'd helped her through a difficult time with her own children, and a neighbor mentioned how I'd always been kind and considerate. The letters gave me strength, but it was hard to ignore the fact that my own parents were actively trying to prevent me from helping their granddaughter. Meanwhile, Chloe was opening up more during our visits. One afternoon, she told me that she'd always felt like she didn't belong anywhere, that foster care felt like being passed around, like nobody wanted to keep her. Hearing that made me even more determined to provide her with a permanent home, a place where she could feel safe, loved, and valued. For the first time, she started talking about things she wanted to do in the future, becoming a veterinarian, visiting the Grand Canyon, learning to play the guitar. It felt like a breakthrough, a sign that she was beginning to trust me, to believe in a future beyond the instability she'd known. As Chloe's birthday approached, I learned from Mrs. Ramirez that she'd never had a real birthday party. I decided to throw her one. I invited a few of her foster siblings, as well as some children she'd recently met at school. We kept it simple with pizza, cake, and a craft station where the kids could make their own animal masks. When Chloe walked into the living room and saw the decorations, her eyes widened in surprise. She'd never been celebrated like that before. At the end of the party, Chloe hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you, Aunt Mimi." It wasn't a declaration of mom, and I didn't expect it to be. But it felt right, a sign that we were building something real, something lasting. The custody hearing was the final, and most daunting, hurdle. On the day of the hearing, a distant cousin, Sarah, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, showed up unexpectedly. She told the court that she was ashamed of the family's treatment of Chloe and that she admired what I was doing. Her testimony was unexpected but powerful. Chloe also spoke during the hearing. She told the judge that she felt safe with me, that she wanted to stay with me. Her voice trembled slightly, but she got through it. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled in our favor. I was granted temporary custody of Chloe, with the expectation that it would become permanent after a probationary period. It was a bittersweet victory. I knew my parents, and much of the extended family, would never forgive me. But I also knew that I'd done the right thing. What mattered was Chloe, and the life we were beginning to build together. That night, after the hearing, Chloe moved into my apartment permanently. We made spaghetti for dinner, and while it wasn't perfect, we laughed through the mishaps, just as we had during her first overnight visit. Later, we started a scrapbook to document her journey, our journey. As I looked at the first page, filled with her drawings and photos from her birthday party, I felt a sense of peace, a sense that we were finally building something real, something strong, something that would last. The next morning, I blocked my parents' phone numbers. It wasn't out of anger, but out of necessity. I needed to focus on Chloe, on our future, and I couldn't afford to be dragged down by their negativity. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were moving in the right direction, two souls navigating a new and unexpected path, together. Chloe's permanent move-in marked the beginning of a new chapter, filled with both joys and challenges. At first, the biggest hurdle was establishing a routine. Chloe wasn't accustomed to structure, to rules. Things like doing homework before playing video games, or clearing her plate after dinner, felt foreign to her. There were a few arguments, some slammed doors, and a few tears. But I remained consistent, gently but firmly enforcing the rules. Over time, she began to adjust, to understand that boundaries were there to protect her, not to restrict her. Mornings were particularly challenging. Chloe hated waking up early for school, and she'd drag her feet until we were both rushing out the door. But by the end of the first month, we'd developed a system. I'd pack her lunch while she got dressed, and we'd share a quick breakfast before heading out. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. At school, Chloe struggled with math. Her teacher sent home notes about incomplete assignments and low test scores. But she also mentioned Chloe's exceptional talent for art. One afternoon, Chloe brought home a crumpled drawing she'd done in class, a vibrant, imaginative depiction of a mythical creature. It was stunning. I decided to enroll her in a weekend art class at the local community center, and she was thrilled. Seeing her excited about something, seeing her passion ignite, gave me hope that we were on the right track. The community around us stepped up in ways I hadn't anticipated. A neighbor down the street, an elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, stopped by one day with a plate of homemade cookies for Chloe. She told me she'd heard about Chloe's story and wanted to make her feel welcome. Over the next few weeks, other neighbors introduced themselves, offering help or simply stopping to chat when they saw us outside. Chloe even made friends with a boy her age, Liam, who lived across the street. They bonded over a shared love of video games and spent afternoons riding their bikes around the neighborhood. For spring break, I planned a short trip to the coast. Chloe had never seen the ocean, so I decided to take her to a nearby beach town. The drive was long, but we passed the time singing along to the radio and playing I Spy. When we finally arrived, Chloe ran straight to the water, shoes and all, and laughed as the waves splashed over her feet. It was the happiest I'd seen her. We spent the weekend building sandcastles, collecting seashells, and eating way too much ice cream. On the way home, she fell asleep in the car, clutching a smooth, gray stone she'd found on the beach. Back at school, Chloe's art teacher asked if she could feature one of her drawings in a school art exhibition. Chloe was nervous about it at first, but when the night of the exhibition arrived, she was beaming with pride. Her drawing, a detailed portrait of a wolf, was displayed prominently, and parents and students stopped to admire it. Seeing people appreciate her talent boosted her confidence, and I couldn't have been prouder. Things took an unexpected turn when I received a text message from Daniel. It was the first time I'd heard from him in years. He wanted to see Chloe. I didn't know how to handle it, so I sat Chloe down and told her about the message. I made it clear that the decision was hers. She hesitated, but eventually agreed to meet him. The reunion was tense. We met at a park, with me sitting nearby while Chloe and Daniel talked. Chloe was polite but guarded, and Daniel seemed unsure of how to connect with her. He apologized for not being there, but Chloe didn't say much. After about an hour, she came back to sit with me, saying she was ready to leave. It was clear that she wasn't ready for a relationship with him, and I made it clear to Daniel that Chloe's well-being came first. He nodded and left without argument. Not long after, Chloe had another big win at school. She entered a district-wide art competition and won an award for her work. The school held a small ceremony, and Chloe's name was called. She walked up to the stage to accept her award, and the entire room erupted in applause. That night, we celebrated with pizza and a movie, laughing and quoting lines back and forth. It felt like we were finally finding our rhythm as a family. Out of the blue, one of my cousins, Mark, the one who'd been so vocal about the joys of parenthood, reached out to apologize for the way he'd treated me. He admitted he'd been wrong to judge me and said he admired what I'd done for Chloe. I accepted the apology, but I kept my guard up. Too much damage had been done for me to fully trust him, and I wasn't about to let anyone disrupt the peace Chloe and I had found. The rest of the family, of course, continued to gossip. I'd hear snippets of their conversations through mutual acquaintances, claims that I'd stolen Chloe from Daniel, or that I was trying to make myself look good. It didn't bother me anymore. Chloe's happiness was my priority, and the rest was just noise. One evening, as we were setting up for our new weekly tradition, Art Night Fridays, where we'd create something together, Chloe looked up at me and said, "This feels like home now." Hearing that made all the challenges, all the struggles, worth it. As we sat down to paint, I realized we weren't just surviving anymore, we were thriving, building something strong and beautiful together. Chloe wasn't just healing, she was growing. And so was I. Together, we were creating a future that felt like ours. Life with Chloe continued to evolve, bringing new joys and, inevitably, new challenges. The first significant hurdle came when Chloe started falling behind in school again. Her teacher called me in for a meeting, pointing out that she was struggling to focus in class, that her homework was often incomplete or rushed, and that she'd become increasingly withdrawn. At home, the frustration spilled over into a few tense moments. She slammed doors, stomped off to her room, and refused to talk. I knew it wasn't just about the schoolwork, there was something deeper going on. One evening, Chloe finally confided in me. She admitted that some of the kids at school had been teasing her again. They'd found out she was adopted and had started calling her names, making her feel like she didn't belong. I could see how much it hurt her, even though she tried to shrug it off. Instead of dwelling on the hurt, I suggested we channel those feelings into something positive. I encouraged her to express her emotions through her art. Chloe reluctantly agreed, and what she created blew me away. It was a powerful, evocative drawing of a lone tree, battered by a storm, its roots clinging fiercely to the earth. I decided to enter the drawing into a local art competition. Chloe's piece won second place, and she finally began to see the power of her art, the way it could connect her to others and help her process her emotions. Around the same time, Daniel began contacting me more frequently. His messages started innocently enough, asking how Chloe was doing, if she was eating well, if she was happy. But they soon escalated into demands to see her more regularly. I didn't want to cut him off completely, but I also knew I needed to protect Chloe. I encouraged her to decide what she was comfortable with. After a few hesitant phone calls, she told me she wasn't ready for more visits. I relayed her decision to Daniel, but he didn't take it well. The calls from him became more persistent, more demanding, and I realized I needed to set firmer boundaries. The rest of the family, of course, found out about Daniel's renewed interest. They accused me of overstepping my bounds and trying to erase Daniel from Chloe's life. The gossip reached a boiling point when I ran into my mother at the grocery store. She barely looked at me before saying, coldly, that I'd ruined everything by adopting Chloe. Her tone was icy, and it was clear there was no reasoning with her. I didn't argue, I simply walked away. After that encounter, I contacted my lawyer and had him draft a legal letter, outlining the terms of Daniel's contact with Chloe. I wasn't taking any chances with her well-being. Back at school, Chloe's struggles were still a concern. I met with her teacher and the principal to develop a plan. They suggested extra tutoring, more one-on-one time with her teacher, and a referral to the school counselor. I also reinforced positive habits at home, no screen time until homework was completed, a consistent bedtime routine, and regular family meals. Slowly, gradually, Chloe began to find her footing again. She even made 2 new friends at school, one of whom shared her passion for art. They spent hours sketching together, trading ideas and encouraging each other. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Chloe came into the kitchen while I was cooking dinner. She stood there for a moment, hesitant, before asking, "You're not going to give me away, are you? Like my dad did?" The question broke my heart. I stopped what I was doing, knelt down to her level, and told her, firmly and unequivocally, that she was my family, forever. No matter what. She nodded, but I could tell it would take time for her to fully believe it, to internalize the security of our bond. A few days later, a letter arrived from my parents. It was long and scathing, blaming me for tearing the family apart and demanding that I make amends. I didn't reply. I wasn't about to let their negativity consume the life Chloe and I were building. To give Chloe a sense of ownership and belonging, I decided to convert part of the basement into an art studio for her. We painted the walls together, a vibrant shade of turquoise, and set up shelves for her supplies. She chose a bright yellow desk as the centerpiece, and I added a corkboard where she could display her favorite pieces. When it was finished, Chloe beamed. She spent hours down there, sketching, painting, experimenting with new techniques. It became her sanctuary, her safe space. There were also small victories along the way. Chloe came home from school one day, waving a spelling test with a perfect score. We celebrated with her favorite dinner, mac and cheese with hot dogs, and spent the evening playing board games. It was one of those nights where everything felt easy, right, natural. As I watched Chloe's progress, I realized that we both had a lot of healing to do. But we were doing it together, step by step. My focus shifted towards helping her build confidence, independence, and resilience. She wasn't just my responsibility, she was my family. And together, we were creating something strong, something enduring, something that would withstand the storms that inevitably came our way. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the clouds were parting, revealing a brighter, more hopeful future. Chloe had found her roots, and so had I. Chloe's art teacher, Ms. Evans, approached me one afternoon with exciting news. She'd submitted one of Chloe's drawings, without telling her, to a regional art competition. And it had won first place. The competition organizers wanted to feature Chloe's work at a school-wide assembly and present her with an award. When I told Chloe, her face lit up with a mixture of pride and nervousness. The thought of standing in front of her classmates terrified her, but I reassured her that she didn't have to say much, just accept the award and smile. On the day of the assembly, Chloe dressed up in a new dress I'd bought her for the occasion, fidgeting nervously with the hem. When her name was called, the crowd erupted in applause. She walked up to the stage, clutching the microphone awkwardly. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the audience, before speaking. Her voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. "Art, it helps me say things I can't say with words," she told the room. "It makes me feel less alone." By the time she stepped off the stage, the applause had turned into a standing ovation. But the moment wasn't without its complications. After the ceremony, as we were taking photos with Ms. Evans, Daniel showed up, unannounced. I spotted him lingering near the back of the crowd, looking hesitant and unsure of himself. When Chloe noticed him, her expression shifted from excitement to confusion. Daniel approached cautiously, but his presence created an immediate tension. He started talking to Chloe, but his words quickly turned into a defensive tirade about how he'd been trying to reach her, how I was keeping her from him. Chloe froze, unsure of how to respond. I stepped in and calmly told Daniel that this wasn't the time or place. His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby parents and teachers. I firmly asked him to leave, and eventually, he stormed off, muttering under his breath. Chloe's excitement from the ceremony was dampened, but we managed to salvage the day with ice cream and a quiet evening at home. I knew I needed to reinforce the legal boundaries I'd established, to ensure that Daniel couldn't disrupt Chloe's life again without consequences. A few days later, Chloe was unpacking a box of old belongings I'd stored in the basement when she found a small photo album. It was filled with pictures of her as a baby and a toddler, most of them with Daniel. She brought the album to me, flipping through the pages, her expression a mixture of curiosity and sadness. We sat together, looking at the photos, and I answered her questions as best as I could. It was a bittersweet moment, but it gave Chloe a chance to process her past, to connect with the memories of her father before the addiction had taken over. Meanwhile, the family drama continued to simmer. My extended relatives had taken to social media, accusing me of stealing Chloe from Daniel and spreading false stories about how I'd manipulated the system. The posts were harsh and filled with lies, but I ignored them. I didn't need their validation, and I wasn't about to let their toxicity affect Chloe. Unexpectedly, Sarah, the cousin who'd supported me during the custody hearing, reached out again. She'd seen the posts and wanted to publicly defend me. She wrote a heartfelt post of her own, calling out the family's hypocrisy and praising me for stepping up when no one else would. Her words carried weight, and the tide of public opinion shifted slightly in my favor. At school, Chloe's principal called me to commend her progress. He told me that Chloe had become a role model for other students, especially those who struggled with confidence or faced difficult home situations. Hearing that filled me with pride. Chloe's transformation was visible in everything she did. Her art was even displayed at a local gallery's youth showcase, where community members stopped to admire her work. Seeing Chloe stand beside her drawings, confidently answering questions about her process, was one of the most rewarding moments of my life. One night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Chloe looked at me and said, "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." The words caught me off guard, and I had to turn away for a moment to compose myself. Moments like that made every struggle, every challenge, worth it. The family wasn't done, though. My mother showed up at my door one afternoon, unannounced, trying to guilt me into forgiving them. She claimed the family was falling apart because of me, and that I needed to fix things. I stood firm, telling her that my priority was Chloe and her well-being. She left angry, but I didn't waver. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Daniel. It was surprisingly heartfelt. He admitted his mistakes, apologized to Chloe, and promised to work on himself before trying to be a part of her life again. I showed the letter to Chloe, and we decided to keep it for when she was ready to process it. The final confrontation with my family came at a wedding I attended with Chloe. As expected, the whispers and side eyes started immediately. At one point, a relative made a snide comment about my charity project. I'd had enough. I stood up and calmly called out their hypocrisy, reminding them of all the times they'd ignored Chloe when she needed help. Then, I took Chloe's hand, and we left. Chloe's confidence continued to grow. She started researching high schools with strong art programs and talked excitedly about her future. To celebrate her achievements, we continued adding to our scrapbook, documenting her journey, our journey. As we glued photos and drawings onto the pages, it felt like we were closing the door on the past and stepping into a new chapter, together. Our bond was unbreakable. And for the first time, everything felt exactly as it should. The unexpected path had led us to a place of love, belonging, and a future filled with hope. The family we had created, the two of us, was stronger than any blood tie. We were home.